Now, the rest of the story. Dr. Gull opened the door, and there stood Eddy. "Sorry to bother you at home," the latter apologized. It was quite all right, the old physician assured him. Since his partially debilitating stroke the year previous, it was actually more convenient to see patients in his home. Now, what seemed to be the problem? Eddy looked down at his own trembling hands. "They won't stop shaking," he said. "Any other complaints?" the doctor asked. "Only headaches," Eddy reported. "And, oh yes, a peculiar ulceration behind his right ear." Dr. Gull carefully examined the young man, but nothing he discovered contradicted his first impression, that the rather obvious matter with Eddy was syphilis. Syphilis! And the physician was about to reveal his diagnosis when, glancing into the patient's eyes, he found himself suddenly speechless. For though they appeared at least superficially, as one might expect in the advanced stages of Eddy's condition, there was something else, something behind the penetrating stare that first intrigued and then gradually alarmed Dr. Gull. So, determined to explore what he sensed was lurking in the shadows of the disease, the doctor asked Eddy if he would allow himself to be hypnotized. Eddy said yes, and this is the rest of the story. Dr. Gull sat Eddy in a comfortable chair with his back to the light, had him focus on a fixed point, and then with soft, suggestive words he lulled him into a state of semi-sleep. Therein the patient spoke of a friend, James Stephen, and of his anger toward his own father. Dr. Gull listened intently. Then suddenly, disturbingly, in a voice oddly changed, Eddy began describing a knife, and then a woman in the darkness, and another woman, and another. Eyes closed now, he leaned forward in the comfortable chair, and to the physician's horror, his patient, slashing the air with the imaginary knife, began acting out the murders of the women he had described. Through the awful interminable hour that followed, Dr. Gull furiously took notes, and when he could bear the gruesome revelations no longer, he brought Eddy out of the trance. "What happened?" Eddy asked with astonishing innocence. The physician's answer was nothing. And yet so overwhelmed was Dr. Gull by what he had heard that for the first time in his distinguished career, he shattered the sanctity of doctor-patient confidentiality. He notified the city's police commissioner, who in turn notified the suspect's family. You see, the details of the murders, they were real murders, including subtleties the authorities had kept quiet, were precisely as the patient had related them. For once upon a sensational spree of crime, there was a demented young man whose friends called him Eddy, and whose powerful family sought to protect its reputation by stashing a serial killer in a private sanitarium for life. But should you ever again hear extolled the virtues of Victorian England, you will recall the incredible case of Eddy, Queen Victoria's own grandson, Prince Albert Victor, and the shady ladies of Whitechapel, done in by a deranged syphilitic, whom history remembers as Jack the Ripper. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. So what do you think? Could Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddy to his family, really have been Jack the Ripper? The theory that the prince was Jack the Ripper has been popular for many decades, but the prince was not a suspect during his lifetime. The theory of Prince Albert Victor's connection to Jack the Ripper murders first appeared in 1962 in the book Edward VII by French novelist Philippe Julien. 8 years later, Dr. Thomas Stoll published an article in the Criminologist called A Solution, in which he alluded to the prince being the murderer. Dr. Stoll referred to the killer only with a capital letter S and never explicitly said the prince was the murderer, but his argument is pointed firmly at the prince. Before publishing his theory, Dr. Stoll burned all of his research notes and papers in reference to Jack the Ripper. He died just days after his theory was published, so no one could question his research. Since the 1960s, many books a graphic novel. Films have claimed that the prince was responsible for the murders. To conclude that the prince really was Jack the Ripper, we need to follow the evidence. Now let's take a closer look. The murders happened in and around the Whitechapel district of London from late August to early November 1888. The canonical 5 Ripper victims are Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Just as it is in our modern times, the press reported constantly on the royal family. We can actually retrace their travels to determine where certain members of the royal family were on any given date. Now let's take a look at the murders. At about 3:40 on the morning of August 31st, 1888, a man named Charles Allen Cross was walking to work along Bucks Row when he discovered what he initially thought was a tarpaulin on the ground at this gated stable entrance. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was the body of a woman, later identified as Polly Nichols. Polly was lying on her back with her eyes open. Her legs were straight and her skirt was raised above her knees. Another man on his way to work, Robert Paul, approached and spoke briefly about the dead woman. They pulled her skirt down to preserve her dignity, ran to fetch a policeman, and found P.C. Jonas Mizzen a short distance away. When the policeman arrived, Polly's legs were still warm. Surgeon Dr. Llewellyn determined that Polly had been dead for approximately 30 minutes. Now, where was the prince? At the time of Polly Nichols' murder, the prince was at Danby Lodge in Yorkshire, England, over 200 miles away. Then, at about 5:15 on the morning of September 8, 1888, Albert Kadosh, a tenant of 27 Hanbury Street, went into his yard to urinate. His home did not have indoor plumbing. He heard a woman say, "No, no." Then he heard something hit the fence dividing his property with 29 Hanbury Street. But Whitechapel District was a bad part of town. He thought little of it at the time and went back inside. Annie Chapman's mutilated body was discovered less than 45 minutes later by John Davis, an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street. Now, where was the prince? At the time of Annie Chapman's death, the prince was at the cavalry barracks in York, again over 200 miles away. At about 12:35 on the morning of September 30th, 1888, a policeman named William Smith saw Elizabeth Liz Stride with a man at number 40 Burner Street. The man was carrying a package that P.C. Smith later said was about 18 inches long, but with no reason to suspect anything, P.C. Smith continued on his patrol. Approximately 25 minutes later, Louis Dimschutz drove his horse and two-wheeled cart into the poorly lit Dutfield's yard. The entrance is just under the carriage wheel in this picture. His horse abruptly shied to the left to avoid a dark object lying on the ground. Louis struck a match and saw a dead body lying on the ground. She was still bleeding from a single knife wound on her neck. Louis ran for help. When policemen arrived, parts of Liz's body were still warm. They suspected that the killer had been interrupted by Louis. Then, at approximately 1:44 on the same morning, just 44 minutes after Liz's body was discovered, policeman Edward Watkins discovered the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes lying on her back in the southwest corner of Mitre Square. P.C. Watkins had passed through Mitre Square just 14 minutes earlier, but the body was not there at the time. According to Google Maps, the average person can walk the distance between the location of Liz's and Catherine's murders in just 17 minutes. Now, where was the prince? At the time Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were killed, the prince was with Queen Victoria at Abergeldy Castle in Scotland, over 500 miles away. Queen Victoria recorded in her journal that the prince had lunched with her on September the 30th. Sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock on the morning of November 9th, 1888, Elizabeth Prater, who lived directly above Mary Jane Kelly's rented room, along with a guest, Sarah Lewis, heard a scream. This being the roughest part of London at the time, screams during the night were nothing new. They thought little about it at the time. At about 5:30 that morning, Elizabeth walked past Mary's room on her short walk a block north to the 10 Bells for a drink of rum. She saw nothing out of the ordinary. At about 10:45 that morning, Thomas Bowyer went to Mary Kelly's room to collect the rent, which was 6 weeks overdue. He knocked on the door, got no response. He went to the window, but the curtains were drawn. He removed a piece of cloth which had been used to plug a broken window pane and pulled back the curtain. Thomas was shocked to see the extensively mutilated body of Mary Jane Kelly. The following crime scene photograph is very graphic. If you want to look away for a moment, I'll let you know when it's off the screen. Investigators believed Mary had died sometime between 1:45 and 8 o'clock that morning. They determined that her body was so badly mutilated because the killer struck in a private room, which enabled the murderer to take his time. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly is considered by most to be the last of the so-called Jack the Ripper murders. Now the photograph has been removed from the screen. At the time of the murder, the prince was at Sandringham House, a royal residence in Norfolk, England, just over 100 miles north of the scene of the murder. Now let's take a closer look at the theory. The theory that the prince was Jack the Ripper was based on another theory that the prince had contracted syphilis from a prostitute while on a royal tour of India, and he went on a killing frenzy in London out of revenge. An additional theory was that the prince was so incapacitated with syphilis that he had others commit the murders for him. You see how these theories tend to snowball, one built on top of another. Once one theory falters when analyzed, another theory is introduced to explain the problems with the prior theory. It's that old concept of a lie upon a lie upon a lie. Now, let's take a look at the prince's lifestyle shortly after the murders. Remember, the murders occurred in the fall of 1888. In the following year, 1889, when, according to one theory, the prince was supposedly on death's door due to the effects of syphilis, the prince proposed to his cousin, Princess Alix of Hesse and Bahrain, at Queen Victoria's suggestion. But Princess Alix respectfully declined his proposal. They were too good of friends, she said. 5 years later, Princess Alix married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and was executed along with her entire immediate family during the Russian Revolution. In 1890, Queen Victoria suggested another potential bride for the prince, another cousin, but it never got past the discussion phase. By May of 1890, the prince had fallen in love with Princess Helena of Orleans, but her father refused to allow the marriage because Helena was a Roman Catholic in the Prince's Church of England. Helena offered to convert to the Church of England, and the prince offered to renounce his royal status, but her father still refused. Finally, in 1891, the prince decided he wanted to marry Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, another distant cousin. Queen Victoria supported the prince's decision. On December 3rd, 1891, the prince proposed, and she happily accepted. The wedding was set for February 27th, 1892. While the details of the upcoming royal wedding and the prince's appointment as Viceroy of Ireland were being finalized, the prince fell ill. But he was not suffering from the effects of syphilis. The Asiatic flu, as it was often called, was a worldwide pandemic which lasted from roughly 1889 to 1892. It was one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. In early January, the prince contracted influenza, which developed into pneumonia. On January 14, 1892, just 6 days after his 28th birthday, the prince died from pneumonia at Sandringham House, surrounded by his fiancée, family, and multiple doctors and nurses. Historians and criminologists have proven that Eddy, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, presumptive heir to the English throne, could not have been the serial killer most commonly known as Jack the Ripper. There is no evidence that the royal family had anything at all to do with the murders, although it makes a good story. Mark Twain once quipped, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good story." And it seems the authors and believers in the theories that the prince was Jack the Ripper took Mark Twain's quote to heart. But facts are stubborn things. That's a quote from our second president, John Adams. Now that I've explained who Jack the Ripper was not, who was Jack the Ripper? Well, every few years someone claims to have solved this mystery which has endured for over 135 years. But it's likely that we'll never know for sure. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.